political reform in England benefited from a contest between liberals and conservatives. Nothing better illustrates this contest than the fight between William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. They both realized the power derived from popular support. And so they introduced legislation to try to bring workers to their side, either to the side of liberals who were trying something new, or the side of conservatives who wanted to preserve the old as much as possible. Neither one of them wanted a revolution. And so they introduced political legislation that brought the English working class into the system. This wasn't supposed to happen. After the Great Reform Bill of 1832, the Whigs and the Tories, the Liberals and the Conservatives, both agreed that the Great Reform Act was final, that it was enough to expand popular participation from 435,000 voters to 656,000 voters. But as the population of England grew, that idea of finality slipped farther and farther away. It wasn't realistic to tell a growing number of English voters that, oh, we did the reform is done, there's no more left to be had. And so in 1867, in this conflict between Gladstone and Disraeli, both of them start talking about expanding suffrage. And eventually out of that debate comes another Reform Act in 1867 that lifts voting from 1.5 million voters to 2.5 million voters. This expansion of suffrage changed the political debate because it pushed the qualifications for voting downward. More working class people got to vote and had a say in government. One concrete benefit of this was the Civil Service Reform Act of 1870. Political parties and the ministries that came out of them saw government service as a form of patronage. That when you win an election, you get to appoint the government officials. It's a source of income. With the Civil Service Reform Act, Parliament mandated a level of competency before getting a government job. Civil servants had to complete exams. Now, these exams were in the humanities. They were learn simple exams of being able to read, write, do arithmetic. But it wasn't that I'm going to give a job to Uncle Bob because Uncle Bob is my favorite. There was an expectation that there was a civil service. It wasn't Her Majesty's service. It was there to serve the public and to act as a civilizing force. Parliament also then passed the secret ballot, 1872. Up until this time, ballots had been public. Someone had to stand up in public and say, I'm voting for. Public voting created a whole set of opportunities for abuse. Landlords could evict their tenants. Bosses could fire their workers. With the secret ballot, a worker, a renter could go into a voting booth, put their choice on a box, and they could vote their own conscience. They didn't have to vote the way their superiors or their betters in town recommended. It solidified the idea that your average voter was in charge of the country. They didn't have to defer to a landlord, didn't have to defer to a boss, didn't have to defer to a priest. This secret ballot increased individual liberty. Parliament then took a big step in introducing proportional representation, having reapportionment on a regular basis, so that each of the parliamentary districts remained relatively the same size. It was pretty clear by 1885 that populations in Europe were radically changing, in particular, the rise of urban areas. So it made no sense to freeze electoral districts by a parliamentary decree and that they would last for 20 or 30 years. They needed to be constantly updated as modern society was mobile. People move from place to place. Populations grow, populations decline. Parliament needed a permanent mechanism to keep a balance in representation. That it was important that you come close to this idea of one person, one vote, one man, one vote, so that some districts don't have more political power than other districts. All of these reforms benefited from a combative politics of liberals and conservatives wanting to make sure that neither one of them was able to leap ahead and monopolize political power. What they didn't expect was a whole new political party emerge, the Labor Party 1900. It was a direct result of adding workers into the voting mix. What the Labor Party favored was democratic socialism. They wanted a more democratic political system, a system that responded to voters, not to the House of Lords, not to the monarch. And socialism, they wanted public ownership of property. They wanted public ownership of railroads, public ownership of ports, public housing. They did not believe investments from the City of London, like the equivalent of Wall Street, benefited everyone equally. And so they were in favor of using public votes to create more public property. They wanted public ownership of resources, production, and distribution, coal mines, factories, railroads. They wanted the wealth created by workers to go back to workers. Neither liberals or conservatives were willing to bend or bow to this new demands of this Labor Party, but they had to respond to them. And so one of the significant reforms that come at the end of the long 19th century was the Parliament Act of 1911, in which David Lloyd George brought up the question of money bills, what Americans call a budget. Which branch of government should determine the budget? Should it be the House of Commons? Should it be the House of Lords? Should it be the King? And what David Lloyd George eventually settled on was that if the House of Commons passed a money bill, 3 consecutive sessions, passed it, blocked by the House of Lords, passed it, blocked by the House of Lords, passed it, on that third passing of the House of Commons, the money bill would become law. Now, this effectively made the House of Commons the sovereign of England. because they had complete control of the power of the purse. In other words, it established the supremacy of the House of Commons. The House of Lords knew this, but the King of England, Edward, threatened it, that if the House of Lords did not agree to the Parliament Act of 1911, then the king would simply create enough peers that the House of Lords would vote to approve. And he was prepared to create as many peers as necessary to get approval of this Parliament Act of 1911. When the king sided with David Lloyd George, there was nothing the House of Lords could do. They were outmaneuvered, and it made the House of Lords basically a debate club. They could review, they could argue, they could call attention, but it really established that the decisions made by the House of Commons were final, because money determines policy. And this Parliament Act of 1911 enshrined into law that the House of Commons had the final say over money bills. It was the culmination of 100 years of political reform. It was the direct result of popular sovereignty.